I want to thank the organizer for inviting to this meeting. It's nice to see old friends and new friends here in this room. And my thought was just to give a pulse of the situation where we are. Obesity has been a major issue for a number of years, and doesn't seem that, although we have start getting a better understanding of metabolic processes, physiological processes, medical issues, still there is a long way to go in that the incidence continue to remain elevated and actually increase in many places. So where are we? Has essentially a month ago or less, there were two releases from the World Health Organization and the CDC here in Atlanta, and the numbers were not very pleasant. Worldwide, we have about 1.9 billion people, 18 years of age or older, who are overweight. More than 500 million are definitely obese. And this means that about 39% of adults are either overweight and 13 obese. Women seems to have a slightly higher incidence of obesity than men, and this is across races, with particular incidence in Hispanics and African American. And more worrisome, there are 42 million of children below the age of 5 who are already overweight or obese. This worldwide. In the US, we are not doing any better. Obesity has doubled since 1980. We were 1 in 8 was obese in 1980, now it's 1 in 3. There are 38% of women and 34% of men who are obese. And as you see, there are the incidents, as I said, seems to affect more the Hispanics and the African American population. And this is a picture in the world, and you can see how we are progressively increasing. And what is more concerning to some extent is obesity for a long time was considered a disease of the developed country, but now developing countries are experiencing a much faster rate of obesity than in the past. So it's definitely something is not quite right. And that is true both for men and female. You can have it there. As you can see, this is just worldwide, just released for the WHO. As I say, in the US, we go from this profile in 2011 to 2014. And you can see that the map is changing progressively, drastically all throughout. And even by race, it's giving essentially the same profile. I don't want to go too much through the criteria that are used to determine obesity. I mean, they are now very well set and used worldwide. Essentially, we can use either the BMI as an indicator, although some controversy exists whether perhaps the hip to waist ratio could be a better indicator than the general BMI, at least for the prognosis and the progression of the obesity. And because of the high number of people affected, we clearly have a significant money going into either the research, the treatment, and the long-term effect associated. If you see, this is splits the obesity, the cost in US. This is from about 3 years ago. We have about $200 billion in obesity and another 250 in diabetes. So cumulatively, we are approaching about $500 million just for that. That does not include cancer, which is considered a complication, and heart disease, which are two of the major complications associated with obesity. Causes, as you see, is and I don't expect you to read because it's so intricate that we have very multifactorial process, and it really doesn't help. Clearly, in keeping with the goal of this meeting, which is obesity and weight, most is related also to the relationship we have with food and associated element. As you see, the classical food pyramid is, in many cases, is being replaced by what is the junkie pyramid, where we tend to use a lot of empty calories that don't provide, while they are rich in calories, they do not provide sufficient nutrients to the whole system, to our body. They might be lacking nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients, and selective minerals that might be necessary for our body function. The other thing that we have been progressively experiencing has been the portion distortion, portion that were quite common 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now being very rapidly supersized by the new portion. In the past, you were going to a movie, you could have like a can of Coke. Now you have 32 ounces of Coke. And the portion of popcorn is also increased proportionally, cheese, and all the other items. So I use this sometimes for my students in the physiology course, and provocatively says how many sugar cubes. And it's a kind of a cross-section of how much sugar we are intake. Mountain Dew is the highest, with about 77.5 grams of sugar in a 20 ounces bottle. Just to keep in perspective, clinically we use the OGT, or glucose tolerance test. We give 75 grams of sugar, and the patients always balk away and say, oh, that's too much. And here we are. That same patient might be drinking 2 or 3 Mountain Dew in a day, and basically take it 3 times that amount. And if you consider that normally 75 grams of sugar are normally renormalized in 3 hours, you can have an idea what this can do to our body. And that is not just unique. I mean, you can see Monster Energy, it's quite significant. Coke, it's by 65 grams of sugar. Vitamin water already has 31 grams of water, 31 grams of sugar. So it's definitely something more than we actually need in our regular diet. And this is a comparison out of the web or the internet, where you can see all the different most common drinks in the U.S. and how many calories they intake with each one. And drinking diet not necessarily solve the issue. It might sound like the most easy way to go through, but a series of papers published in Nature, Cell Metabolism, or other journals is now pointing to the fact that artificial sweeteners are differently metabolized by our intestinal microbiota and induce insulin resistance, or different way interfere with our glucose and fatty acid metabolism in different ways that are not completely understood. And definitely indication that these artificial sweeteners do play a role in a current situation that in terms of obesity and weight management. So if we want to go through the cause of obesity, this is as good as any other scheme you can have available. We have psychological factors, a variety of these endocrinopathies that can play definitely a role. Drugs that we intake for treatment or for other reason. There are clinically indicated mental and physical disabilities that can affect from Down syndrome to variety of mental illness, including eating disorders. Physical disabilities that clearly reduce our ability to be mobile and move around and use some of the calories for energetic purposes. There are social factors, reduction in exercise, a more sedentary style of life, all things that I'm sure all of you are well aware of. behavioral factors in terms of how we relate to food and how we consume food in amount and in quality. Environmental factor for sure have a role, especially if you consider developed and developing countries. They might have completely different settings of environmental factor play into the situation. And of course, genetic factors. I mean, we are who we are based on our genes, and we cannot escape from that. The picture showed before that certain ethnic races seems to be more prone to develop overweight and obesity are clearly indication that the genetic component is either affected or respond to any of these other factors involved in the process. And the consequences are clearly more diverse, from the insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, which are the most common. The CDC, along the line of the obesity, just released a report for the type 2 diabetes in the United States. We are about 1.4 million new cases every year. It's slightly down from 1.7 a few years ago, but still quite a large number per year. Cardiovascular issue, obstructive sleep apnea, which then tap into the cardiovascular diseases, and a variety of other psychological problems in the way we perceive ourselves, the way we relate to other people, which clearly affect our social life and can reinforce sometimes our lack of a movement, or make us more prone to a sedentary life. Medical complication, quite a variety. We go from pulmonary disease to hypertension, stroke, coronary artery disease, diabetes, GI diseases, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is becoming one of the most common observation by ultrasound in the U.S. or worldwide, is now to be considered indicative of a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but more importantly of metabolic syndrome, obesity, and associated complication. And clearly there are gynecological abnormalities, from the ability to be fertile to associated issue, and think of the work that our skeletal and bone system has to do to support the weight of an obese person. So it's becoming very vicious cycle in many cases, making the situation worse and worse. So hunting the culprit has clearly been the goal all the way throughout. We have a variety of targets. As I say, we go from the microbiome. As we said, our diet can change what our intestinal flora is, but also the consequence of that can be widespread. Indication, for example, could be developing a more gram-negative bacteria which release endotoxin in the circulation that affect liver function, but also intestinal leakness. Clearly, enzyme and gene mutation at different levels, from think about your organ of interest or your system of interest. I'm sure you will find gene and enzymes that are changed over time. There has been an increasing association with celiac disease to perhaps indicate a more underlying autoimmune dysregulation of our system. Variety of autoimmune disease, whether they are Hashimoto or to some extent even some form of diabetes, but more importantly, the dysregulation of the adipose tissue, the adipocytes and adipokine production. Diet clearly taps into this. We go from artificial sweetener, we just indicated, to perhaps a decrease in protein content. There is some data out there suggesting that making an interesting correlation with the time coincidence between the progression in obesity and the amount of protein that we intake in a diet. Yes, our diet is rich in calories, but mostly these are coming from carbohydrate and lipids, and the protein content, which is one of the shutdown signal for our neurohumoral system in terms of indicating we are full, is not there in sufficient amount. I mentioned decrease in micronutrients. I indicated zinc, selenium, and magnesium, which are probably three of the most common micronutrients that are found being reduced in obese patients. But if you think the implication zinc has for the autoimmune system, selenium for specific selenium protein, magnesium for a variety of metabolic function from metabolism to cell cycle, food preservatives. We don't really know what we are intaking in many cases. There is a large push to more organic product, but at the same time there is also a very large push towards engineered new product that we intake, and the long-term effect, if any, of these new engineering products that are more resistant to plant disease are still not known in the human population. Inflammation is clearly one of the major cause, or at least it becomes kind of a cause-effect situation, because there is evidence of elevated systemic inflammation in obese patients in terms of joint, in terms of muscle that are affected. But at the same time, there is a clear evidence that change in the adipokines, in adipose tissue, isoforms. There is a more increase, for example, in TNF-alpha production, which comes back to downregulate the insulin receptor. It's part of the natural feedback, negative feedback for the insulin signaling, but when reach very large proportion, it's actually undermining and preventing their insulin effect, and then especially in peripheral tissue, and here we have peripheral resistance all the way throughout. Environmental toxin, sure. There is some evidence that oil-related products are associated with potentially changing the ability of the insulin receptor to operate. So the scenarios is pretty wild, pretty vast, and coming up with a very comprehensive and one-size-fits-all situation is really not possible. Different part of the world may experience different scenarios, combination of this associated with what the diet and the genetic background of that part of the world might be. And therefore I want to, probably is a little bit shorter than anticipated, but I want to go back to this picture. And again, I don't expect you to read it, but I want to just leave it with it to indicate how multifactorial the issue that we are addressing is, and any little step forward that we can do in any of this area is clearly helping us to understand a little bit better where we are and what can be done, whether even if it's just a simple psychological approach that can help a patient control how much food he or she is intaking, or perhaps more in terms of children, and preventing their progression into a path that ultimately is not beneficial for them and for the whole society. So I will leave that with this, and I will take any question.